If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The year was 112 AD, on the edge of a Roman provincial town not far from the Tiber's lesser tributaries. The town was small, its streets rough with uneven stones, its walls weathered from years of neglect. Farmers came to sell grain and olives. Soldiers on leave drifted through taverns, and freedmen tried to make their place among the citizens. Beneath this mixture of people lived a tension. Those who fell from favor or honor were quickly judged, and whispers spread faster than trade goods. Among them walked Lucia, the daughter of a once prosperous landowner who had controlled olive groves outside the town walls. When raiders struck the countryside 2 years earlier, she was taken, returned days later in silence, and never spoken of in her family again. Her father refused to acknowledge her. Her brothers called her a source of shame, and her mother could not lift her eyes to meet her own. Cast out, she survived by mending garments and trading scraps of bread for oil. She was not old, barely in her mid-20s, but the strain of disgrace and hunger had hollowed her cheeks. She walked with her head low, her shawl drawn tightly, as though the cloth itself could shield her from the stares of those who knew her story. On this morning, she entered the temple courtyard. The air inside smelled of burnt offerings of oil lamps and fading incense. White-robed attendants swept the floor, their movements precise. She waited until the others stepped aside, then approached the priestess Marcia, a middle-aged woman with sharp but steady eyes. Lucia's breath caught in her throat, and when she finally spoke, her words came raw and trembling. "Priestess, I am no longer pure." The confession was not new. She had whispered it to herself countless times, but never so openly. She expected the priestess to frown, to turn her away, to demand silence. Instead, Marcia's gaze rested on her calmly, almost sternly, but not without a trace of sympathy. Inside, Lucia's stomach twisted. She felt the weight of every moment since her capture. Fear from that night, shame when her family closed their doors, and the long months of surviving in the corners of the market where others passed without seeing her. She thought of leaving the town more than once, walking the road until her legs gave out, but she had no coin, no kin, and nowhere to go. Staying felt like weakness, leaving felt like death. Beyond the temple gates, another figure had just entered the town. His name was Marcus Varro, a man near 40, his tunic faded and his sandals worn from the road. He carried no badge of office, no sign of trade. The scars on his forearms and shoulders told their own history. Years as a gladiator, purchased as a slave, forced to fight, and finally freed after too many campaigns in the arena. Since then, he had wandered from town to town, sometimes working with builders, sometimes serving as a guard, never settling long enough to claim a home. Inside him, there was little peace. He carried memories of comrades who had fallen, of nights when the roar of the crowd drowned out the last breaths of men he knew by name. His wife, a woman from Campania, had died of illness long before his freedom. Since then, silence was his companion. He was not cruel, but he spoke rarely, as if each word cost him something. Marcus entered the town not with ambition, but with simple intent, to find a place to sleep, a task to earn his bread, and to pass another day without conflict. He noticed the temple only in passing, the way he noticed every stone wall and broken arch, but he paused when he saw a woman in the courtyard. She was small, shoulders drawn inward, her shawl pulled tightly. He recognized the posture instantly, not of pride, not of arrogance, but of someone braced for scorn. Lucia, still kneeling before the priestess, felt the strain in her chest ease only slightly as she released her words. She did not expect absolution. She did not even expect comfort. What she wanted, more than anything, was acknowledgement that her suffering had not erased her completely. Yet even as she thought this, she feared she was wasting her breath. In her mind, one path led only to more judgment, the other to silence. Marcus lingered outside the gates for a moment, though he did not enter. His eyes shifted, measuring the town's people, the way they glanced at the woman in the courtyard with quiet disdain. He understood it at once. He had lived long enough to know what it meant when a community marked someone as ruined. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He turned away, carrying on toward the stable where he hoped to find shelter, leaving behind the faint echo of her trembling words. That morning, though neither of them knew it yet, their lives had crossed at the very edge of survival. She, broken by exile from her own family, and he, a drifter marked by years of violence. Both carried wounds that words could not fully describe. The day wore on with the weight of heat pressing against the tiled roofs and stone alleys. Lucia left the temple courtyard with her shawl still clutched tightly around her, but her thoughts were louder than the bustle of the marketplace. The priestess had not condemned her, yet she had not absolved her either. Instead, Marcia told her quietly to live, to endure, and to remember that the gods saw more than men did. Those words gave a flicker of strength, though not enough to silence the fear that clung to her. She wondered if she would ever feel safe walking openly through the forum again, or if she would always be the woman people avoided with quick glances and muttered judgment. She turned her steps toward her small rented room near the edge of town, a place no larger than a storeroom, but it kept the rain off and gave her a door she could close. Marcus had taken shelter in the stable owned by an old freedman named Quintus, who let out space to travelers for a small coin. He laid down his satchel on the straw, his body aching from the road. His first thought was practical. He needed work to stay alive. He had strength, and men in towns like this always needed someone to move stones, cut timber, or guard a cart on the road to the next village. Yet he knew how his scars marked him, how whispers of Gladiator stirred both curiosity and unease. He had learned to keep his head low, to let silence be his shield. The questions left unspoken in the first day hung heavily. Who exactly was Lucia beyond the whispered scandal? Why had Marcus come here when he could have chosen another road? Chapter 2 carried those answers slowly into view. Lucia had once been betrothed before the raid that destroyed her family's trust in her. The young man, son of a merchant, had withdrawn his promise the day after she returned, saying he could not bind his bloodline to hers. The rejection had stung deeper than her family's coldness, for it confirmed what the town now believed, that her worth had been stripped away. She carried this history in every step, though she never spoke of it aloud. Marcus, for his part, had not come to this town by choice alone. He had wandered for months, avoiding larger cities where old enemies or former patrons might remember him. He had once belonged to the ludus in Capua, and though he had been freed, freedom for a gladiator was never simple. Some saw him as a relic of blood sport, others as a threat, others as a man who owed debts unpaid. He sought smaller towns like this one because they gave him fewer eyes to answer to. His only function now was survival. Find labor, eat simply, and endure the emptiness that came with each passing season. Their paths crossed again that evening. Lucia went to the well outside the forum to draw water. The rope was frayed, the bucket heavy, and her thin frame strained against it. Marcus, passing by on his way back from speaking with a mason about work, stopped without a word. He stepped forward, gripped the rope, and pulled the bucket up with steady force. She startled, her heart tightening in her chest, unsure if she should thank him or fear him. Men in town often offered help only to remind her later of her shame. But this man said nothing. He set the bucket at her feet, gave a short nod, and turned to leave. His silence confused her more than words might have. She called after him, almost against her own will. You're new here?" He paused, his back still to her, before answering with a voice low and measured. "Only passing through." That was all. He walked on, leaving her with the water and a strange sense of unease mixed with relief. For the first time in months, a man had looked at her without contempt or hunger. The thought unsettled her, but it also stirred a faint trace of curiosity. That night, as she sat alone in her narrow room, she replayed the moment. She wondered why he had helped her without asking anything in return. She wondered if he had recognized her name or her past. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined entirely by shame, though the thought frightened her as much as it comforted her. Marcus, lying on straw in the stable, thought briefly of the woman at the well. He had not planned to stop, but something in the way her hands trembled against the rope had compelled him. He dismissed the thought quickly. Attachment was dangerous, and he had no intention of settling. Yet as he closed his eyes, the image of her eyes watching him lingered longer than he expected. The town remained restless, its people sharp with judgment and quick to notice strangers. Both Marcus and Lucia felt the gaze of others, but neither yet knew that the silence they shared would become the first stone laid in something steadier than either had allowed themselves to hope for. The following days moved slowly, and yet each carried small changes that did not go unnoticed. Lucia kept to her routine, leaving her room early to buy flour, trading sewing work for coins, and fetching water at the well. But now, when she stepped into the marketplace, she found her eyes drawn almost against her, well toward the places where strangers gathered, half expecting to see the silent traveler again. She remembered the ease with which he had pulled the bucket from the well and the way he had walked away without comment. It unsettled her because she could not explain it. Men in the town did not help without making her feel the cost. Marcus had found work with the mason after all, hauling stones from a quarry outside the walls. The labor was harsh, but he welcomed it. He had grown used to the weight of stone and timber during his years after the arena, and he knew that steady work kept his body strong and his mind distracted. Still, as he returned through the forum one afternoon, his eyes fell on the woman again. She was kneeling near a collapsed roof beam outside her room, struggling with tools she did not know how to use. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and lifted the beam into place, holding it steady while she hammered the nails with clumsy but determined strikes. She looked at him only once, surprised, but this time she did not flinch. It was here that questions the listeners might ask became clearer. Where did she live, and how did she survive without family? How did a woman alone keep a roof over her head? The answer was plain. Lucia rented her space from a widow who owned several small storerooms near the southern gate. She paid with whatever she could earn by mending tunics, patching cloaks, or selling loaves made from poor grain. It was not enough to lift her above poverty, but it allowed her to survive in silence. She had no relatives left willing to claim her. Her father had died of fever the year before, and her brothers had pushed her from the house long before that. She survived not because she was welcomed, but because she refused to die in the streets. For Marcus, another question remained. Why did he stay in this particular town when he had passed through so many before? The truth was that he had no reason to move yet. He had coin enough for a week or two, the work was steady, and the people did not know enough about him to fear him openly. He also knew that moving constantly had not lessened the weight of his past. The silence in this town was the same as in the last. Perhaps, he thought, staying a little longer mattered no less than leaving. As the days turned, their small encounters became more frequent. At the market, he carried a basket for her when the weight grew heavy. At the well, she waited a moment longer if she thought he might appear. Their words were still few, yet their gestures grew in meaning. She gave him a piece of bread one evening, warm from the oven, though her own food was scarce. He accepted it without speech, only a small nod, but his eyes softened in a way she noticed. The townspeople also noticed. Whispers began again, sharper this time. The disgraced one, they muttered, she has found company with the scarred stranger. Some shook their heads, others laughed quietly. Lucia heard their words, felt the sting of them, but when Marcus stood beside her, they did not speak as boldly. His presence, silent and firm, was enough to remind them he was not a man to be provoked. That night, Lucia lay awake in her small bed, her mind restless. She asked herself what she was doing, why she let this man's presence matter to her. He was nothing to her, only a drifter who could vanish tomorrow. But she also remembered how his hands steadied the roof beam, how he had eaten her bread without mockery. She realized she feared him, leaving more than she feared the town's gossip. The thought both frightened her and brought a small warmth she had not felt in years. In the stable, Marcus also turned slowly on his straw bed. He had promised himself not to attach, not to let anyone close, but he could not deny the truth. The woman's resilience reminded him of something he had long buried. She had endured disgrace, hunger, and abandonment, yet she still rose each day. He respected that, perhaps more than he respected the men who judged her. For the first time in years, he wondered what it might mean not just to pass through a place, but to remain. The fragile rhythm of their companionship had begun, and though neither dared to name it, both felt it growing in the silence between them. The summer heat pressed heavier on the town, making the air thick with dust and sweat. Work slowed for many, but Marcus remained at the quarry, hauling stones under the sun until his shoulders burned. In the evenings, he often returned past Lucia's door, and each time their exchanges grew less accidental. She no longer pulled her shawl so tightly when he was near, and he no longer passed in silence without at least acknowledging her with a nod. One evening, as the day's labor ended, he found her sitting on the step outside her room with a basket of torn garments. The cloth was rough, the threads thin, and her hands trembled as she tried to mend them. He stood for a long moment before asking, his voice low and measured, "Why do you keep so much work for yourself?" She looked up, startled that he had spoken more than a word or two. Her first instinct was to defend herself, to hide her struggle, but she realized the truth was already visible. Because if I stop, I have nothing. The coins buy grain. The grain becomes bread. The bread keeps me alive. Her tone carried no bitterness, only plain fact. This answered a question that might have lingered in listeners' minds. How exactly did she survive day by day, with no family to provide for her? The truth was simple and grim. Lucia endured by sewing scraps, baking bread, and stretching every coin to its limit. Her existence was not one of choice, but of necessity. Marcus crouched beside her, his hands rough with stone dust. Without asking, he lifted one of the garments and held it steady while she worked the needle. She hesitated at first, surprised by his quiet insistence, but allowed it. The silence between them deepened into something less fragile, more useful. She stitched, he steadied, and together the torn cloth slowly became whole again. As the days passed, their cooperation grew. When she needed firewood, he carried it. When he brought back bruised fruit from the quarry camp, he left it by her door. Neither spoke of these things openly, but each small act built upon the last. The town, however, did not remain blind. Whispers turned sharper. At the market, a woman muttered loudly that shame attracts shame. A man laughed that the gladiator had found himself a ruined wife. Lucia felt the words pierce, her stomach tightening, but Marcus's presence beside her silenced them. He never threatened, never raised a hand, but his stillness and the scars on his body were enough. That night, Lucia questioned herself again. Why did she allow this man near her? Why did she not push him away as she had pushed away others who offered help? She found no answer except that he did not ask for anything. He did not remind her of her shame. He did not try to possess her or demand her gratitude. He simply stayed. The realization unsettled her because it awakened a hope she had forced herself to bury. Marcus lay awake as well, his body aching from labor. His thoughts returned to her more often now. He asked himself why he had not moved on as he always did. The answer rose clear in his mind. In her resilience, in her steady survival despite the contempt of others, he saw a reflection of his own fight to live beyond the arena. She was not weak. She had endured. And for the first time in years, he felt that his silence was not only a wall, but something he could share with another. Here, another question was addressed. What exactly did Marcus want from this town? Listeners might wonder if he stayed only for work or because of her. The truth was both. Work gave him coin, but her presence gave him reason. Without admitting it aloud, even to himself, Marcus had begun to choose staying over leaving. Their companionship was still unspoken, fragile as thin clay, but each day it became harder to deny that something lasting was forming between them. Neither named it, neither dared to, but in their silences, in the steady gestures of survival, a bond deeper than words was already being shaped. Autumn settled over the town, bringing cooler air and shorter days. The harvest from nearby fields filled the market with grain and fruit, yet for Lucia the season remained the same. Counting coins carefully, stretching each one for bread and oil. Still, there was a difference now. She was no longer seen alone. Marcus, though he said little, often walked beside her when she went to buy provisions. His presence was steady, unforced, and impossible for others to ignore. People noticed. Some frowned openly, others whispered in corners. But something unexpected also began to emerge. The priestess Marcia, who had listened to Lucia's trembling confession weeks earlier, watched the pair from the temple steps. Where others saw disgrace, Marcia saw survival joined with dignity. She remarked quietly to another attendant that the gods often worked through ordinary men rather than emperors or generals. Her words spread softly, and while not everyone believed them, they planted a seed of doubt in the harsher judgments. This addressed an unspoken question left hanging since the first chapter. What role did the priestess truly play in Lucia's life? Until now, she had been only a listener, but here it became clear she was also a quiet supporter, offering not absolution but recognition. For a woman cast out by her family, such recognition carried weight. Marcus, too, began to change in ways that others could see. He no longer avoided the forum at night. He shared labor not only with the mason, but sometimes with farmers, carrying sacks of grain or repairing carts. When asked, he spoke simply and without arrogance. The town had known gladiators as figures of blood and spectacle, but this man, though scarred, worked as steadily as any of them. His reputation shifted slowly from that of a dangerous outsider to a reliable hand. One evening, after they returned from the market, Lucia found herself speaking more freely than she had in months. She asked him why he had never left, why he stayed when he clearly had no ties here. He answered after a long pause, "Leaving has given me nothing. Here I can work. Here I can stand beside you." His words were plain, almost blunt, but they carried a weight that left her silent. She had not expected him to speak so directly. That night, she sat by the small fire in her room, thinking of what he had said. The thought both frightened and steadied her. She had learned not to trust promises, not to believe in men's words. But his were not promises. They were explanations, simple truths. For the first time, she considered the possibility that she was not entirely alone. Listeners might have wondered another question left unanswered. How did Marcus, a freed gladiator, carry no chain of obligation, no fear of being reclaimed by an old patron? The truth was that he had purchased his freedom with years of fighting, and though some in Rome might still see him as marked, legally he was his own man. The risk of pursuit was less now, for his name was not known in this small town. This explained why he could remain without fear, why he could stand beside her openly. The market gossips did not disappear, but their voices grew less sharp when faced with his silent presence. Children who had once mocked Lucia no longer laughed when they saw him lift her baskets. The shift was small, but she felt it. For the first time in years, she walked through the town, not with her eyes fixed on the ground, but straight ahead. The feeling was unfamiliar, almost fragile, yet it was real. That night, when Marcus sat outside her door to rest after work, she stepped out and placed a loaf of bread in his hands. "It is not much," she said softly, "but it is what I have." He met her gaze for the first time without turning away, and in that silence both understood that what they were building was no longer accidental. Their bond, unspoken but undeniable, had become part of the life of the town itself. The days ahead would test it further, but neither of them doubted now that their paths had joined. Winter came early that year, the wind sharp against the stone walls of the town. The marketplace grew quieter, and people hurried about their errands wrapped in cloaks. Lucia kept her fire small, conserving wood, but she was no longer fighting the cold entirely on her own. Marcus often returned with bundles of timber from the quarry camp, setting them by her door without a word. She stopped protesting the gifts. She understood by now that they were not given from pity, but from a plain sense of duty he had chosen to carry. By this time, the whispers in the town had begun to shift again. What had started as ridicule had turned into a kind of resigned acceptance. The people could see with their own eyes what words could no longer deny. The disgraced daughter had not broken, and the silent gladiator had not left. Their quiet bond had outlasted gossip. Even the widow who rented Lucia her room softened her tone, allowing her a little more time when the rent was late. Survival, once fragile, had become steadier. Questions that lingered from the beginning found their answers here. Would Lucia ever be able to regain dignity after her family's rejection? She had, not through forgiveness from kin, but through the life she built with her own hands and the man who stood beside her. Would Marcus always remain a restless drifter? He had found, in this town and in her company, a reason to remain. The priestess Marcia played her part as well. She summoned Lucia and Marcus to the temple, not with sternness, but with calm clarity. The gods do not measure you by the whispers of men, she said, placing her hand upon theirs. They measure you by what you endure and how you remain. In a small ceremony, simple and without grandeur, she blessed their union. There were no garlands or feasts, only a few neighbors watching, curious but silent. Yet for Lucia, it was more than enough. For Marcus, it was the first moment in years where he felt the past no longer ruled him. That evening, they returned to her small home, no longer separate but joined. She baked bread, and he repaired the doorframe once more, this time knowing it was his own house too. The silence they shared was no longer heavy, but steady, the kind of silence that meant peace rather than fear. The story closed there, complete. Lucia, once broken by shame and cast out, stood with her head high. Marcus, once a man of blood and drifting silence, had chosen to stay. Together they had built something neither of them thought possible. A life not marked by disgrace or scars, but by presence, trust, and the act of remaining when others had turned away. Their bond, carved slowly through survival and endurance, ended not in loss or uncertainty, but in a home, a family of two, and the quiet certainty that both had found where they belonged.